name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Mr. Dennis Pink.
That's me.
A psychotherapist with Sullivan and Nolan and Associates. Dennis Pink, welcome to A2 Insight.
Thank you, Jim. It's good to be here.
We're very glad to have you here. I like to start out all my shows with the same. We want to learn a little bit more about you. Our viewers would like to know a little bit more. If you could just start out by giving us a little bit more about where you grew up, your early influences, family life, and so on, and why don't you get us through your academic interest in college?
Oh, boy. A few things happened there. I grew up in Minnesota. I was a Gopher growing up. Now I'm a Wolverine, as you can see, with the blue, and if you look at my shoes, blue and maize. And I lived there until I was 15 years old. Was always interested in sports. I played basketball, baseball, football, everything. It was cold there, so we had to play indoor sports in the winter, of course. Came here when I was 15 years old. I was always interested in people and watching people, and my mother, in fact, told the story of when I was a little kid. She would drop me off at what was then the dime stores, and I would watch the demonstrators, and I'd watch them, how they gathered the crowd around them, how they motivated them, and of course then they sold their products to them, and she would leave me there for an hour or so, and I was just fascinated by that. So that was kind of an early start. Came to Michigan, played sports again. I played baseball, and I focused on basketball, and I was a decent...
Where in Michigan did you go?
It was in Oak Park, a suburb of Detroit. We moved.
From where in Minneapolis?
It was a suburb of Minneapolis, St. Louis Park.
Okay.
So I came to Michigan. The sports was sort of an entree into meeting people. In high school, I was a decent high school basketball player. I learned how to score a lot of points. And then I was interested also in literature and things like that. I was not a real serious student, but I had an intellectual curiosity. More interested in sports, however.
That's certainly a theme so far.
Yeah, it is. No, and it still is.
Okay.
And it still is. Then I went to school and in fact, played a little college basketball at Central Michigan.
Okay.
For undergrad, and I realized very quickly that I wasn't going to be a professional basketball player, and that the practices were 3 hours long, and I decided I wanted to do other things. And I was still interested in literature and English. I actually majored in English, minored in psychology and sociology, and then decided to do some teaching and taught high school. And that's what brought me to the Ann Arbor area. I taught high school and coached basketball and some other things. But one of the ways I started a class, and I taught at Dexter High School years ago in psychology there. And I became interested in psychology. When you teach something, you study, and I kind of got made up for my undergraduate deficiencies by reading books and watching things and teaching the class in psychology. And high school kids loved psychology. They're going through this period in their life that is a tough period that we'll be talking about in a few minutes, but they're in that transition between dependence on their parents and independence, and going through all kinds of changes and social changes where their peers become more important than their parents, actually. And I found that in coaching, I had a special relationship with the kids that I didn't have in the classroom. And some of the same kids I had in the classroom I would coach. And a lot of them would come up to me with some of their issues and so forth in their family life. and I thought, this might be an area that I would like to get into. By the way, teachers are my heroes, one of my heroes. That is a tough job. I did it for 4 years. It's much tougher than what I did after that. It's a performing art. They have to motivate these kids, do lots of other things, and try to teach them something. And I was exhausted. At the end of the day, I did it for 4 years. And then I went to graduate school, got out of, transitioned. Graduate school, I went some to Michigan, some to Eastern. And originally, I went into school psychology and became a school psychologist. And my background working with kids, particularly with high school kids, but I've worked with all ages in the schools. When I was working in the schools from preschool all through high school, and I felt I could relate to those teachers on what they were going through and the stresses and the pressures they had in the classroom.
Sure.
And I would pull kids out of their classes to do evaluations and to talk with them. And it was much easier than what those teachers put up with every day. So I enjoyed doing that. I did it, and I got applied for my license in psychology. I got that, and started working at a clinic years ago, and have done other things in business with my brother. But I love having an impact on kids during this transitional periods in their life. So I focus now on adolescents and adults, but that's what I've done. That's my background.
All right. Well, that's very interesting. One of the reasons we have Mr. Pink with us here today is that sadly, those of you who are regular viewers of our program know that we interviewed Trish Cortez, the executive director of the Washtenaw County Community Mental Health, a couple of episodes ago. And unfortunately, we're confronting one of these horrors in our society, which certainly weren't there in the past, and that would be the rising problem and challenge of teen suicide and attempted suicide. In this county, unfortunately, Washtenaw County is leading the state at this point. And one of your specialty areas in terms of psychotherapy, I believe, is dealing with adolescents. Obviously, having been a teacher and a coach, you're certainly familiar with their challenges, and we're going to try to focus on those specifically. I guess I just start out with your deal with the issues of adolescents. What is the problem with today's youth and this sad revelation of an increased suicidal ideation in our culture today?
Yeah, well, we know it's like doubled in the last 10 years of hospitalizations for suicide. We have more and more kids that are thinking about it, and more and more kids that are acting upon those thoughts. There's many reasons why I think that's occurred. One of the big ones is stress. Our kids are under a lot of stress. Not that we weren't under stress when we were kids, but there's more stress now. And that's causing depression with some kids. Some kids are reacting in that way, some with lots of anxiety, and some with some anger. So when we look at it, of the causes of it, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what it is, but we know what's going on in my practice. I see these kids. So one of the things that we see, and I think that adds to the actual suicides, we call them successful attempts. It's a funny way to say it, but kids that have died during the suicide, is the models. There is some what we call social contagion, that they read about it, they see about it. I had a week about a month ago where I had 3 suicides in my practice of people who were affected by it. Nobody that I was seeing, but their friends, their roommate in college. It's something that it's looked at now, I think, as an option. As an option for kids, unfortunately. And there are things that we can do, and we'll talk about that for prevention, but we're seeing more and more of it, and I think one of the reasons is the kids cannot handle this stress. Some of that is due to parenting of kids, and I've got a book that I want to recommend to parents out there that I think works very well with kids. It has to do with what kids are exposed to in terms of the internet, the bullying, they have to deal with it every day now. It's not just when you were a kid, maybe on the playground or whatever, but it comes back to them, through their iPhones and their computers. But many kids, I find, are not inoculated against stress. Oftentimes, growing up, we find kids that no longer play on the playground for societal reasons and danger that their parents perceive. They don't go out by themselves and work out issues. They're protected from that. And the book that I'm going to recommend one of the themes is we have to let kids fail. It's the way kids learn how to walk, They stumbled, they fell, and as early as possible, because the consequences of their failures early on in life are not as great as the consequences of their failures when they run into drugs and sex and other very important issues and school, in high school. So some of these kids didn't learn how to work that out early on naturally, and they've been protected. And that's when they get to high school or get to middle school and they get bullied, they're overwhelmed with it. And they become very anxious and depressed, and then they have some of these thoughts. There's the social contagion about it.
Sure.
They don't know how to handle it.
Well, and again, I think what is fascinating, we will talk about the specific possible solutions to something like this and some recommendations you have, but at the same time, one of the things that's amazing, and it is the technological reality that, well, you've got people that constantly are, well, you can go to any restaurant in town and see a family of four sitting there. No one's talking to each other.
Right.
They are literally communicating through text messaging, having a meal together. So we have more ability to communicate as a society, and yet we're apparently more lonely than ever because of that aspect of it. That people can create. I mean, I don't know if I read something about that woman who, went after the YouTube crowd. She had 10,000 followers, and somehow the number of likes and all of this artificial connection with people is certainly one of the problems. But you mentioned also there is a technological, but also is there something in the transition? I mean, you were a teacher for years. Is there any other reality of the educational, the way we teach now, the lack of recess that contributes to this from your perspective that you've seen?
That's part of it, but I really think it's connected to kids not knowing how to be by themselves, that they've learned, they have all these gadgets, they have their computers, they have their phones, they have their music they're listening to. They're not used to alone time. And one of the things that happens that it's what a fellow by the name of Viktor Frankl talked about. He said there's an existential vacuum that's created. And why am I existing? What do I do? What purpose do I have in life? This is related to that suicidal stuff too, the suicidal ideation. And what he said was, if you can figure out a why, you'll figure out a how. Why? Many people, their meaning in life comes from their work. It comes from their family. It comes from the relationships they have. It comes from spiritual meaning, whether it's religious or non-religious spirituality. And our society has lost a lot of that. Of, you know, the relationship, and it's also tied back to what I was talking about before, of consequences for behavior and failing, to see the relationship between what I do and what happens to me. Whether it's motivation to work, whether it's motivation to do well in school, that connection has been lost.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I observe this. We come to smaller families today. We have maybe 2 kids as opposed to when I was growing up in this town, 4 or 5 kids. I went to watch a baseball game for about 7 or 8-year-old children, and they were all there. And it wasn't baseball as I had seen it. Their parents were everywhere, children were everywhere. Right. The kid was swinging 7 or 8 times, and she just gave up and walked away because, and then she was wildly enthusiastic, applauded for this. You know, yeah. I mean, is there any relevance between the assumption that you have self-esteem, which is very important for children, and yet isn't there an aspect of that coalescing with and dovetailing with the whole concept of children need to learn how to fail? Are parents saying, are they making the thought that my kid needs to feel great about themselves when they don't necessarily, they're not earning that? Is it the self-esteem without having a sense of failure or some contributions one of the problems you're talking about?
Absolutely. And kids figure that out real quickly. You know, I didn't do so well, and I was applauded for it. And it does a couple things. One, are my parents lying to me? I knew I didn't do well. And number 2, when I do well, they gave me the same applause. So it's taken away the meaning of the verbal rewards and pats on the back and things like that, and adds to meaninglessness of their lives, that they don't see the relationship between what they do and what they get.
Well, that sounds that's certainly one of the dangers that does.
Now, not all parents are like that. We've got great parents, you know, involved parents, but nobody ever had to take a test to be a parent.
Right.
You do have to do that to drive a car, but not to be a parent. And they're well-meaning, most parents that I work with.
Sure, but they don't. As I said, there is the mindset. Now, the interesting thing is, going back to the educational challenges.
Yeah.
The concept of education, particularly in the 70s, early 70s, for elementary school children particularly, even this seems to be an issue with that age group, if you can believe it, was children went to school, and they would learn in school, they would do recess, and then they went home. There was no homework. They played. Now, is there any correlation between the fact that the competitive world, and I've been to Asia, and I know how the Japanese and all the, you know, there's no emphasis on extracurricular activities in Asia. I mean, these kids go to school all day and then they go to private tutors because it's so competitive. Is there this stress that you mentioned, this academic, even second, third, fourth grade? I mean, is this a natural byproduct of the global competitive environment we live in today?
Well, that could be part of it. I certainly see it in adolescence, not so much in elementary school students, but they are getting more and more, it's filtering down that pressure of, you know, down to preschool. You know, to get into a good preschool, you have to be prepared to do this, and to get into the kindergarten, and then to the right school, and then if you want a special, you know, advanced school, you've got to do this. And then certainly when they hit middle school, they're hearing about college and what it takes to get into college and what it takes to get into a good college. And I want you to go to a better college than I went to because I know that's important. And a lot of kids are feeling this stress, certainly are. And you're right, going back to that playground things, that's where kids work things out. We played ball after school. You know, if you were bullied by somebody, you figured out a way. Maybe you would take your ball and go home, or you'd get your big brother and say, hey, I'm gonna, you had these social alliances that you figured out. And some of that hasn't been done now.
Interesting. Well, I guess this does lead to something that, because hopefully we want to be a resource for our audience and parents here. I mean, I think we're going to go to try to find out the solutions that we're talking about the problem, but also what are kind of the warning signs? If I'm a parent of a teenager right now, and you know, she or he is having some either struggles. I don't necessarily aware of it. There's certainly moodiness and things that happen as a teenager. What are some warning signs that I, as a parent or caregiver, should be aware of with a teenager that may be heading within this dangerous path to potential issues as it relates to suicide or major depression?
Yep. One thing is they talk about it, and that takes, some parents aren't aware of what's going on with their kids, so the parents and the kids don't have a good relationship or a positive relationship, and so the kid doesn't talk to the parent about it. But some kids will say things such as, boy, I'm under a lot of pressure, maybe I'd be better off not being alive. You know, I can't take it anymore. Things like that. Social isolation. The kid spends a lot of time in his room, maybe, you know, with his electronics hooked up, and that's a change in their behavior. The drastic changes is what we usually find happens before suicide attempts. Things like drop in grades, not wanting to talk about their friends, sleeplessness, sleep disturbances, either too much sleep, they want to stay in bed all the time, or having trouble sleeping, signals of depression or anxiety. That feeling of hopelessness that we talked about before, you know, there's nothing I can do about it, Mom. I'm just dumb. I don't have any friends. And they throw up their hands and they become isolated and depressed. Mm-hmm. So those are the kind of things. Sometimes a lack of appetite, you know, a change in their mood or their personality we look for. But those are all signs to get some help, you know, and to get somebody to talk to about it. And the nice thing, the positive thing about it in this area is the social stigma is not what it used to be. Sure. That you're seeing a counselor, you're seeing a therapist, you're seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist. In fact, it's very common, almost a status thing in some neighborhoods for kids to be seeing a therapist. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be mentally ill to see a therapist, but there are some things that might be sorted out and help early on with seeing a professional.
I guess that would be the question, assuming I have a parent that's suffering these various maladies of loss of appetite and everything, and we come across a competent therapist, such as yourself, hopefully not necessarily just for the status motivation, but because they want to help their kid. And I'm employing you as a psychotherapist to help my kid.
Right.
What are the resources, or what is obviously a parent is not a trained psychotherapist. What are you going to provide my kid on your hourly, weekly visit that is going to make a difference in his life? Because he's still going to be lonely. He still doesn't have any friends. He's still isolating. What do you bring to the table that is going to save this kid?
Okay. First of all, the concept of therapy has changed over the years. In my practice, it's become very holistic. And we've learned a lot about brain chemistry in the last 10, 15 years to know that certain parts of the brain, the amygdala actually, is what activates depression and anxiety, the two biggies. Why people come into my office. And there's another part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex that is the executive functioning that puts the brakes on those negative feelings. And there's another part of the brain that has a memory that keeps replaying some of these themes of depression and anxiety. So we know more about that. In fact, we've done, a fellow by the name of Greg Siegel at the University of Pittsburgh is doing functional MRIs. If you've done some athletics, you probably had an MRI at some point. Well, these are functional MRIs that actually image the brain activity through the blood flow and it's almost like time-lapse photography, so you can see. And what happens is when a person's depressed or anxious, this part of the brain is lighting up very brightly, and the control part is very faint, very faint. And now we can find out that when that, through therapy and some other things I'll talk about, that the opposite occurs, that the amygdala is going very faintly, and the control part now, the brakes have come in command. So the holistic part, we found out, and I found out in practice, this is what works. Number one, exercise is incredibly important. And the best is aerobic exercise, we found, and with the endorphins that stimulate brain chemistry, and about 20 minutes a day, getting that heart rate up. But any exercise, walking, bicycling, playing ball in the backyard is very helpful for brain chemistry. So that's one part. Number two is nutrition. Now, there's lots out there on nutrition. However, we found out there's certain things that we know are bad for you, that aren't going to help your situation. And I call it functional or dysfunctional. And we know that sugar and white flour, the more you eat, the worse it is for your brain chemistry. And particularly if you're predisposed to some of these other issues. So if a kid is functioning fine and eating lots of sugar, and well, maybe he's not predisposed to this, it wouldn't hurt him, though, to lower the level of that. Number three, sleep. Very important. And number four, therapy. And I use cognitive behavior therapy, a special kind of cognitive behavior therapy, showing how the thoughts that you have are related to the feelings that you have, and how we have a prism of our personal beliefs that we filter a situation and turn it into possibly a very negative emotional experience, such as anxiety and depression. And if we can change some of that stuff of what their beliefs are and modify them in a therapeutic process, we can change those feelings. We can modify those feelings. Does that help?
Well, that helps. And again,
That's what we do. That's what I do.
We're nearing the end of our program.
Okay.
I just want to ask a couple. Do you recommend, given this whole brain chemistry and so on, the use of drugs, particularly for depression and so on? And then finally, if you just mentioned a couple of resources that might be helpful for parents to look on. But I guess in terms of the cognitive, the exercise, and then dealing with brain function, do you feel is the introduction of medication something you recommend in a lot of cases, or is it something you try to avoid based on your therapy, and then maybe some resources? And unfortunately, we're running out of time.
I talk too much.
No, it's a lot of stuff to cover.
I free associate a lot. So actually, I usually charge for it. The thing that what was the question again?
Okay, the question is, do you get, in addition to all the recommendations you have for kids in terms of your therapy, do
the
you
medication.
recommend medications for them? Since you mentioned there was quite a brain chemistry aspect to this, and then also some resources for our for parents to take a look at.
Some kids need medication, very few really. And I would, if it were my child, go first to a psychologist or a social worker, a psychotherapist, and most psychotherapists can tell if a kid is not responding to other forms of treatment. Okay, so, but psychiatrists are the ones, they're doctors that can do medications, that can prescribe medications, and also family physicians. But I would hold that back a little bit. Sometimes they need it. So I don't rule it out. I have some of my clients, I call them clients, unless you're talking to Blue Cross, then they're patients, are on medications, and they're helpful for them. Okay? And I have a few things I wanted to, did I answer that?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, yes, if you just show up for our audience and take a look at these books.
This is a book that's done written by an educator, Jim Fay, and a psychiatrist, Foster Klein. And some of you have heard about it. It's called Parenting with Love and Logic. And I would highly recommend this to any parent out there, whether it's little kids that you have, preschoolers, all the way through high school and beyond, a way to relate to your kids that's going to be very helpful in their development and help them become independent, functioning kids and adults. Okay, so that's one thing that I draw from a lot. The other one is Albert Ellis, and if you can get a hold of anything by him, I would read it. This is one that was written for lay people. He's written a lot of scholarly articles for professionals. It's called How to Make Yourself Happy and Remarkably Less Disturbable, which, and that's the goal of the therapy I do with people, is to make them less disturbed and less disturbable going forward.
Well, I guess most of us would prefer not to have someone who's more disturbable. I do want to thank you so much, Dennis, for appearing on our program. I also want to let you, we will give you your contact information at the end of the show. I also want to let you know that, as we did on the other edition, this is an issue that is facing our community. It's a serious, sad issue that we're hoping we can get some grip on. So I also will be including the 24-hour emergency number that Trish Cortez mentioned. That
I wanted to mention one more thing, just real quickly, we didn't get into, and that was the mass shootings.
Okay, yes, and unfortunately, maybe we'll have another edition on that.
Okay, let's do that.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Because I have some thoughts about that.
I'm sure you do, and I'd love to have you back, but we only have a 30-minute show.
I know.
At any rate, thanks so much for visiting with us. Until next time, I'm James Strost for A2 Insight.